All right. As we began working our way through Biology 1408, what we're going to do is start off with some basic chemistry. Then we're going to move into molecules that are important to living things. We're then going to move on into cellular membranes, parts of cells and functions of those parts. We'll also be moving into how cells utilize energy. We'll go from there on into how cells divide, somatic cells divide, gametic cells divide. We'll also then move on into basically some genetics, and we'll get into some different components of that. And so we're going to take what's called a reductionist approach in Biology 1408. We're going to start off with the little details and keep building. So everything's going to be kind of built upon what we've talked about previously. So we'll go ahead and get started with some basic chemistry. One of the things that I'm going to try and convince you of by the end of the course is that living organisms are really kind of bags of chemical reactions, at the very least. And so what life really is, chemistry is critical because life really is kind of emergent properties coming out of the chemistry of the living organism. Now, to help illustrate this, we're going to take a look at the bombardier beetle here on this slide. Now, this bombardier beetle is experiencing a disturbance. Someone has a pair of forceps. They've grabbed his leg, and he doesn't care too much for that. Now, the bombardier beetle has an interesting way of responding to disturbances. What he can do is he has a couple of different glands, abdominal glands down here, that he can that produce a couple of different chemicals, and he can mix those in a common chamber. Now, when he does this, that mixture will nearly reach boiling point. And then what he can do is he can aim the opening of that common chamber in the direction of the disturbance. So he can then spray that hot fluid in the direction of the disturbance. And it can actually kill some small animals like ants and things. Living organisms, being depending upon basic chemistry for their well-being, actually involves ants living in a part of the Amazon rainforest, and they actually create a monoculture of a tree called Dorora. And so you can see that here with the laser pointer. These are all Dorora plants right here. It's a small flowering tree. Now, surrounding this monoculture, lots of biodiversity one would find. So how do the ants live here in the Dorora trees? Now, the locals refer to these monocultures of Dorora as being devil's gardens. But what creates the devil's gardens, the monoculture of Dorora, are the ants that live in the stems, the hollow stems of the Dorora. And what the ants do to keep any other plants from growing in these cleared out areas, the Dorora only areas, is that they will, and you can see a picture here of this ant. Here's his head. You can see the laser pointer is on his head. Here's his thorax, the middle part, and here's his abdomen. So he's kind of curled, and he's actually stinging a leaf. And what he does when he stings a leaf is he injects formic acid. And that formic acid changes the pH of the leaf cell that he's stinging. And it causes that leaf cell to die. And they just keep stinging leaf cells until they kill the leaf. And they keep stinging leaves until they kill the plant. And what that does is that prevents the Dorora homes from being shaded out by any other plants. So once again, the ants are making use of just basic chemistry. Once again, living organisms are kind of bags of chemical reactions. Now, we're going to be building off of this throughout the whole course. We are going to need to understand that it's atoms, it's elements. They're the foundation of life. Now, we can find elements listed on periodic tables. Now, here we have just a table, not a periodic table, but just a table. And within it, we see some elements are listed: oxygen, carbon, hydrogen, and nitrogen. I'm going to stop there because these four, oxygen, carbon, hydrogen, and nitrogen, they make up about 96% of all living matter. Now, the thing about these big four, we're going to be coming back to them time and time again. Now, just because they make up 96% of all living matter doesn't mean all the other elements don't matter. If you see down below nitrogen, for instance, you see calcium. Well, we don't need calcium in the same percentages that we need one of the big fours, but we certainly do need calcium. calcium is a structural element of bone. We use it in muscular contractions, and in sources of calcium would include like milk, cheese, nuts, seeds, and broccoli. Well, calcium is critical to our well-being. We just don't need it in as large of amounts as the big four. Another example, we've covered calcium. Well, down here we have sulfur. Sulfur is one that is very important to us as well, because oftentimes we need sulfur in the building of amino acids. Some amino acids contain a sulfur component, and eggs are certainly a good source of sulfur. So, anyways, these elements are really important to us. Now, we also, though, if we look down below, we have some elements that we're going to be referring to as trace elements, and you can see the laser pointer here is pointing out some of those. One of them, of course, that we can mention is iodine. Iodine is critical to us. We have to have plenty of iodine in our diet, or we can develop issues. Iron is another real important trace element. Once again, these trace elements we don't need in as large amounts as some of the other elements, but they're really critical to our well-being. We use iron in the building of our hemoglobin, and that's critical in transporting oxygen within our blood. We can, some sources of iron would include like red meat, beans, leafy vegetables. Iodine, another trace element, critical to our well-being, because it enables normal mental development at the time of the fetus. Also, even as we get older, we need iodine. Our thyroid here in our throat region needs iodine so that we can produce certain types of thyroid hormones. Now, this individual here, you can see the swollen neck, of course, that's goiter. And in the case of goiter, what you have is someone who they just don't have enough iodine in their diet, and so their thyroid is working extra hard trying to produce thyroid hormones but really can't get the job done. Seafood, even plant sources that have been grown in soil that has plenty of iodine in it, and of course here in the U.S. we place iodine in with our salt to help deal with or fend off goiter. Now, one of the things that we've mentioned there are at least 92 naturally occurring elements, and here we have that each element has its own kind of atom. So what does that really mean if we, saying that each element has its own kind of atom? Well, they're really different kinds of atoms. And what that refers to is that different kinds of atoms, different elements, and this is what's key, have a different number of protons in the nucleus. Here we see this magenta-colored drawing, and we see a plus sign inside of it. That represents one proton. Here's an adjacent second proton. All right, there is only one kind of element that has two protons, and that's helium. So different elements will have different number of protons. Now, something about atoms is that we can't, split atoms into something smaller and still, have the properties of that element. I mean, the atom is as small as you can go and still maintain the properties of a particular element. Now, how big are atoms? Obviously, they're extremely small. 1 million atoms could be laid side by side across the diameter of a period in your textbook. Now, not only do we have, protons as part of the central component of an atom, we also have these other gray sphere-shaped drawings. These are neutrons. Now, when you think of neutron, think of neutral. There's no charge associated with them. Remember, the protons have positive charge. And then also flying around the speed of light around the nucleus. And by the way, the nucleus, you can see here from the drawing, the nucleus consists of the protons and the neutrons. But flying around that nucleus are these electrons. Now they're showing the electrons as being smaller spheres, and the reality is electrons are way, way smaller than either a neutron or a proton. But electrons have negative charge. So we'll come back and talk about all that. Now, that's what we've looked at are 3 subatomic particles of atoms. And that's the only 3 we're going to concern ourselves with, but there are many more than that. So protons, we've already identified. They're found in the nucleus of an atom. They have a positive charge, and they have and I didn't mention this a minute ago, but they have a mass of 1. And that mass unit is called an atomic mass unit. It's not a pound, it's not an ounce. It's called an atomic mass unit, or sometimes it may be called a Dalton. But Dalton and atomic mass units are synonymous, essentially. Now, when we look at a periodic table a little bit later, we're going to keep in mind that the proton number is also the atomic number. So if you're asked for the atomic number of an element, what we're really asking for is the number of protons. And it is unique. The number of protons is unique to each element. Once again, what we have over here in our drawing, in our figure, is helium. Helium has 2 protons. No other element has 2 protons other than helium. So that's unique to helium. Now, neutrons, as we mentioned a bit ago, they too are found in the nucleus of the atom. You can see that here in the kind of the gray sphere-shaped drawings. And they're electrically neutral. They do not carry a positive charge nor a negative charge. They also have a mass of 1. They're a little bit more of a mass than, say, a proton, but essentially a mass of 1. Now, one of the things that's interesting is that all helium atoms will have the same number of protons, that's 2, but the number of neutrons can vary. So not all helium atoms have 2 protons. There are some that actually have 3. So the neutron number does determine which isotope we're dealing with. Isotopes are just different atoms of an element, like different helium atoms. A helium atom can have 2 neutrons or it can have 3, but all have 2 protons. So a helium atom that has 2 neutrons, a second atom, a helium atom that has 3 neutrons, we would say those 2 helium atoms are isotopes of helium. Okay? Now, when you see something written like this, He-3, well, that's helium-3, and that 3 tells you the mass number. And now, of course, what makes up the mass of an atom? Protons and neutrons only. Electrons do not contribute to the mass number of an atom. So helium-3 tells you a mass of 3. Well, all helium have 2 protons, so helium-3 would have only 1 neutron. 2 protons, 1 neutron. That makes up helium-3. Helium-4 is what's drawn in here for you. 2 protons and 2 neutrons. Helium-4. Okay? So, helium-3 has 2 protons, 1 neutron. Helium-4, 2 protons, 2 neutrons. All right. Well, I'll tell you another real important isotope that we can mention, and that's carbon. Or isotopes, I should say, and those are isotopes of carbon. Carbon-12 is the most common isotope of carbon. Now, you know what carbon-12 refers to? It refers to a mass number of 12. That means the number of protons and neutrons equal 12. And that's what's being shown here. All carbon atoms have a proton number of 6. So carbon-12 has a proton number of 6. Carbon-13 has a proton number of 6. Carbon-14 has a proton number of 6. What differs between carbon-12, carbon-13, and carbon-14 is that carbon-12 has a mass of 12. That means 6 protons, 6 neutrons. But what about carbon-13? Well, because it's carbon, it has to have 6 protons, but it also has 7 neutrons for a mass of 13. That's where this 13 comes from. Carbon-14 has a mass number 14. That means 6 protons and 8 neutrons. Okay? Now notice too, though, that they all have 6 electrons. So we have that kind of drawn up down here for you, and you can see the protons have the positive charge, the neutrons are here, but all the protons and neutrons make up the nucleus, and then the electrons, which have the negative charge, are flying around the speed of light in this cloud area. Okay? So carbon-12, carbon-13, carbon-14 all have 6 protons residing in the nucleus, and these are all isotopes of carbon. But what the numbers really refer to are the mass numbers of each isotope. And the mass number equals the number of protons plus the number of neutrons. Now, one of the things you've probably heard of carbon-14 in its relation to dating certain types of archaeological material. So there are certainly some isotopes that are radioactive, and what that means is they'll break down over time, they'll decay, and they become some other type of element. And in the case of carbon-14, it will break down and become a nitrogen. So what scientists can do is they can measure the amount of carbon-14 in, say, an archaeological sample, and then they know how much should be there, and so they can from the difference they can figure out how old maybe the archaeological thing is, and up to maybe I think it's around 75,000 years or so. So in the case of carbon-14, one of its 8 neutrons will break down and become a proton. Now think about that. This carbon-14 has one neutron that breaks down and becomes a proton. So now this atom doesn't have 6 protons but 7. And if you look on a periodic table, you'd see that any atom having 7 protons is going to be a nitrogen. Now, here's some other isotopes. And some of these radioactive isotopes, we can use in medicine. For instance, radioactive iodine can be given to a patient that has thyroid cancer, because one of the things that thyroid cells will do is take up iodine. And what happens is that by the thyroid taking up iodine at a relatively high rate, the radioactive iodine will actually kill those cancer cells that are taking up the kill those thyroid cells that will take up the iodine at such a high rate. And of course, in this country anyway, I think the number is still somewhere around 20% of our electricity is generated by radioactive isotopes that are releasing, energy within nuclear reactors. The problem with that, of course, is if any of that radioactive matter gets out of the reactor, then that can certainly do some harm to the environment and organisms or individuals out in the environment. Well, as we were saying a bit ago about electrons, we noted that electrons are found out here outside the nucleus. They are not within the nucleus. They fly around the nucleus about the speed of light. They're attracted to the protons in the nucleus, but they don't go stick to them because they have so much energy. They're flying around about the speed of light. So instead of flying, even though they have a lot of energy, they don't fly off away from the atom. Instead, they reside in a cloud around the nucleus of the atom. They carry a negative charge, and as we said a little bit ago, their mass is so tiny compared to, say, a proton or a neutron. About 1/2000th, some authors say. Some other authors will say it's 1/1800th of a proton or neutron. Now, that doesn't mean, just because their mass is tiny, doesn't mean they're unimportant. As a matter of fact, electrons are critical in determining the behavior of the atom. And we'll be coming back to this a little bit later as we start to build some biologically important compounds. As I said a bit ago, these negatively charged electrons are attracted to the positively charged nucleus, but they don't go in and stick to the nucleus, to the protons, because they still have this tremendous amount of energy that enables them to fly around about the speed of light. Now, when you look down here at, say, helium, you see that they've placed in the left drawing the 2 electrons on this circle, this line, and the truth is it gives the false impression that the electrons are like a train on a track or something, and they stay on that line, and that's not the case at all. These electrons are zooming around, and they're found about 90% of this time of their time within this kind of blue cloud, and that blue cloud area is really called an orbital. So electrons tend to reside in orbitals about 90% of the time. And so a lot of times we will draw up atoms and have their electrons on these concentric lines, but the truth is we don't want to get the impression, though, that they are like a train on a track, because that is not the case at all. So the space they fly around in, that cloud, that electron cloud, is called an orbital, and they spend about 90% of their time there. Okay? Now, another thing we want to make note of about electrons, unless you're told the atom has charge, then you need to assume that the number of electrons equals the number of protons. So here in the case of helium, we know all helium atoms have 2 protons. And so unless you're told the helium's carrying some charge, then you need to make the assumption it also has 2 electrons. We know all carbon atoms have 6 protons. So then it's safe to assume that the atom of carbon will have 6 electrons, unless you're told it has some kind of charge. Okay? All right. Now, another thing we're going to talk about. Now, let's start to kind of put some atoms together, because one of the things that we see in atoms is that when they don't have their outer electron shells full of electrons, when they don't have these full valence shells, then they tend to look to figure out ways to get a full outer shell. So what happens oftentimes is substances will actually react with one another and form bonds with one another to kind of satisfy this desire to have full outer shells. Now, let's talk about the compound table salt, sodium chloride. It's kind of interesting because sodium, you can actually cut it with a knife or something, but sodium reacts explosively with water. I mean, that's really something that's kind of interesting, is that, sodium is so, you can go on YouTube or something and find people pitching sodium in water, and you see these creating explosions in the water. And chlorine gas is a very toxic element. It's a toxic gas, and so you can see how within this flask there's kind of yellow gas, and that's chlorine. It's very, very toxic. And as a matter of fact, a lot of our wastewater treatment plants will bubble chlorine into the wastewater to kind of kill down, the bacteria and protist populations in the water, and then they pull the chlorine back out before they dump the water, say, into a stream, so it can go on downriver or downstream. But what's interesting is whenever we react sodium and chlorine, we get something benign as table salt. So it's interesting how when we get elements reacting with one another, we can get some very, very different resulting compounds, and we will certainly see that here in a bit. Now, the key thing about compounds is that compounds consist of 2 different elements, at least 2 different elements. So table salt, sodium chloride, consists of the element sodium and then a secondary element, and that's chlorine. But what about molecular oxygen that we breathe, that we're after in the air? Is it a compound? And it is not, because what is O2? What is molecular oxygen? It's made up of one element, and that's oxygen. Well, something else, we've kind of been, once again, we're doing just some basic chemistry. But you know what? We experience taking in basic chemicals every single day. Chemicals are actually added to our foods to help preserve our foods better, and also to make it a bit more nutritious. If you look on the nutritional fact labeling on your food stuff, like maybe your cereal, and you look down, you see that look, iron's been added within that wheat-based material, as are some other, here's zinc and copper, magnesium, as have some other chemicals as well. We have fluoride being added to our toothpaste. So a lot of elements, compounds, are added to our food stuff or to things we use in our daily lives, and to help keep us healthier. I mentioned a bit ago that whenever we have an element or an atom and it doesn't have a full outer shell, it tends to be reactive. It looks to interact with other atoms to develop a full outer shell. Now look at hydrogen. It has 1 electron in this first energy shell. So this concentric circle represents an energy shell. And it would like to have 2, but it only has 1, so it's going to be reactive. It's going to try and interact with some other element, some other atom, so that it has 2 electrons in its first shell. Okay? Now if we go over here to helium, look at helium. It has 2 electrons in this first energy shell. So guess what? It's full, because this first energy shell can house only 2 electrons. That's a max number. Now if we drop down here to lithium, you see that lithium has 2 electrons in its first energy shell, but in its second energy shell it only has 1. So it has a full first energy shell, but its second energy shell is not full. Now this second energy shell can hold up to 8 electrons. Okay? If we go over here to beryllium, we see that it has a full first shell, but its second shell, its valence shell, its outer shell is not full. It's going to be reactive as well. As a matter of fact, let's go over here to carbon. Remember, carbon's one of the big four that makes up 96% of living matter. We see it has 1, 2, 3, 4 electrons, but remember what we said. This second energy shell can hold up to 8. Carbon is not does not have a full valence shell, so therefore it tends to react with other atoms, as does nitrogen and oxygen, which remember, carbon, nitrogen, oxygen, and hydrogen, the reason they're highlighted in this kind of pale gray color is because they make up the big four. But look what we have over here on the right column. All of these elements have full outer shells. Okay, and everything to the left of the right-hand column do not have full outer shells. So, once again, we mentioned that electrons have tiny mass, but they're critical to the behavior of atoms. So, atoms whose outer shells are not full tend to react with other atoms. We've mentioned that the first energy shell can hold a maximum of 2 electrons. The second energy shell can hold a maximum of 8 electrons. So, will hydrogen tend to react with other atoms? Yes, because its outermost shell is incomplete. And when we say outermost, a lot of times we'll use the term valence, valence with a V as in Victor. Will helium tend to react with other atoms? Well, we know the first energy shell can house only 2 electrons. It has a full shell. How about nitrogen? How about oxygen? How about argon? Well, argon's not going to be reactive, but nitrogen and oxygen certainly will be. So, what atoms do is they're going to tend to react with each other in different ways, attempting to fill their valence shell. Now, the ways that they can oftentimes react with one another will be that they can share electrons with one another. Now, whenever they share electrons with one another, that results in a bond between the two atoms. And since they're sharing electrons and forming this bond, it's called a covalent bond. Now, the number of covalent bonds that an atom tends to form will usually be equal to the number of unpaired valence electrons. Remember, valence means outer. So here we go. So remember, the number of covalent bonds an atom tends to form is equal to the number of unpaired valence electron. So here we have hydrogen, and it has 1 unpaired valence electron, so it tends to form 1 bond. You go down here to carbon. Carbon has 4 unpaired valence electrons. Carbon tends to form 4 covalent bonds. Nitrogen has 3 unpaired valence electrons, so therefore it tends to form 3 bonds. Oxygen has 2 unpaired electrons, so it tends to form 2 covalent bonds. So we've already said carbon will tend to form 4 covalent bonds because it has 4 unpaired valence electrons. Oxygen, 2, and hydrogen, 1. Now, the way that these atoms will end up sharing electrons can be illustrated with hydrogen. 2 hydrogen atoms can come in close proximity to one another, and then what they will do is their electrons will start. Remember, each of them if we're talking about 2 hydrogen atoms, each one will have 1 electron, but as the 2 atoms approach one another, each of their electrons will spend time close to each nucleus of each atom. Now, here's the thing, though. They're going to share, and I'm going to go over here to this table 2.6. Each hydrogen atom will share their electron equally. So these 2 shared electrons will spend equal time around this proton or near this proton and equal time near this proton. Okay? And the reason for that is because the attraction that each atom can exert on the shared electrons is equal. And the term for that is electronegativity. In other words, this hydrogen atom's electronegativity is the same as this hydrogen atom's electronegativity because they are the same elements, so they're going to have equal electronegativities. So what they do is they form a single nonpolar covalent bond. All right, a single nonpolar covalent bond. Sorry, I know it reads nonpolar covalent and it should be bond. after that. Single nonpolar covalent bond. Now, in molecular oxygen, that's the next one we have in our table. Now, remember, each oxygen atom has 2 unpaired electrons. You can see that here. Here's one unpaired electron, here's the other. So, when you have 2 oxygen atoms, what they do is they share their 2 electrons with another oxygen atom. So, you actually have 4 electrons spending time between the 2 nuclei of the 2 atoms. But the electronegativities of the oxygen atoms is equal. So they will share those electrons equally. So the 2 atoms have equal electronegativities. Once again, anytime you have equal electronegativities, because the atoms are of the same element, you're going to get a nonpolar covalent bond. Now, since 2 pairs, right, you have a pair here that's being shared between the 2 oxygen atoms, and you have a pair of electrons here that's being shared, it's going to be a double nonpolar covalent bond. Okay, so this pair down here is one bond, this pair up here is the second bond. Okay.